Welcome to FairCon 2020. During today's session, I want to remind everyone that you can connect with our speakers. All you need to do to engage with them is enable your chat feature in our virtual conference and you can connect with them. Today's session, we are going to hear from a featured speaker. The session is Managing Risk in Times of Crisis, Applying FAIR to Become More Business-Centric During COVID, with Omar Khawaja. He is the CISO of Highmark Health. Omar is the Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer for Highmark Health, a national health and wellness organization and the second largest integrated financing and delivery network by revenue in the United States. In his current role, Mr. Khawaja oversees information security and risk management for the Highmark Health portfolio of leading healthcare businesses that employ more than 40,000 people and serve millions of Americans in all 50 states. Omar is also a member of the FAIR Institute Board of Directors, and he has been recognized in 2018 as the FAIR Business Innovator Award winner. Would you welcome Omar as you tune in to today's session?
Latrell, thank you so much for that introduction. Everyone, thank you so much for being here at FairCon and attending the session. I hope you find it to be of immense value. One of the ways that we can make sure we deliver value throughout this presentation is if you have some questions along the way, feel free to use the chat feature to ask those questions or to share your comments with me and our fellow participants today. Let's get started.
Today's session, I'm going to spend some time talking a little bit about managing risk in times of crisis, applying FAIR to become more business-centric during COVID. The question that I often ask anytime I'm sitting in a presentation is, why am I here? What questions am I actually seeking answers to? Is this actually going to be a good use of my time? Is this going to be purposeful? Or is this not going to be purposeful? And so I want you to start thinking about, in the context of operating and managing a cyber risk program or a component of a cyber risk program in times of COVID, what are some of the things that you're challenged with, some of the things you're trying really hard to solve? And then in a couple minutes, we'll talk about what I've seen as some of my challenges, and I'm hoping to use the next 25 or so minutes we have together to talk about those. You should have access to a live chat window. If you do have questions, you do have comments, feel free to put them in the chat window as we continue our conversation. And so important for us to talk a little bit about where we've been, and the last several months, probably the highlight of what's been happening in all of our worlds is COVID-19. And so I have to talk a little bit about COVID-19, but I promise I will go through them, these next few slides focusing on COVID-19 very, very quickly. And that sort of will then set the context for what we need to do next. From a global impact standpoint, COVID-19 surely is probably one of the biggest events that's happened in most of our lives. Certainly in my adult life, I can't think of any single other event that has had as big of an event. That, of course, then would have had an impact on Highmark Health, which is the organization that I work for, and then specifically the cyber risk program that I manage. So from a global standpoint, if we think about the situation, we know there is a very contagious coronavirus. People weren't immune to it. The implications were that people, if they were to remain physically proximate, large percentage of the populations would contract it. Healthcare facilities would be overwhelmed. From a response standpoint, important to implement social distancing, flatten the curve, and then rapidly deploy testing and treatment facility for patients and in some cases, non-patients as well. From a Highmark Health standpoint, as we look at the situation, it was exactly what the response was from a global standpoint. The implications for Highmark Health, we happen to be an insurer of the Blue Cross Blue Shield for 3 states, soon to be 4 states. We run about 10 hospitals, a few hundred physician offices. And so as you can imagine, for us, we were being impacted in many different ways and being expected to have a very robust and very swift response to this when this started earlier this year. Our employees, we had to figure out how they could work remotely. Our clinicians, we had to figure out how they could see patients remotely. And then of course, we had to build testing and treatment facilities for patients with COVID or suspected to have COVID and make sure that they were isolated from other parts of our clinical operations. And then the response there was, like most of the companies and organizations that you're affiliated with, we sent employees home. We started to meet using meeting technologies instead of in person. We expanded the use of telemedicine. We set up pretty significant infrastructure over a very short period of time to isolate COVID-19 testing and treatment facilities. And then lastly, as we talk about COVID-19 impact from a cyber standpoint, we know what the situation is. All of you have a very good sense of the implications of COVID-19 as it relates to cyber risk. Our response was a few different things. All of our response could be boiled down to 5 specific items. One was to protect the business by strengthening security controls. Second was to enable the business by securely deploying new functionality. The third was to assist other parts of the organization that may have been experiencing increased workload. The fourth was to reduce obstacles, making it easier for, again, the business by relaxing controls purposefully. And number 5, which in some ways was a prerequisite for us to be able to do all of the other items, was to make sure we were adequately engaging our own employees, our own partners, making sure we're taking care of the individuals that are by far the single most important asset to the security program that we run at Highmark Health. And my guess is for the security programs that you all participate in as well. So this was all about the business. The sense of urgency that we experienced, that all of you likely experienced, the sense of being able to just get it done. There was significantly less tolerance for waiting, significantly less tolerance for anything that would prevent the business from doing what we needed to do, particularly as it pertained to our patients, our members, the communities, and the constituents that we serve. So the question then is, with that as a little bit of a backdrop, that being much of what has precipitated my thinking over the last few months and how I'm going to be approaching our cyber risk program differently in the future, the question that allows us to make that pivot is really, where do we go from here? And the answer to me is really simple, as I've reflected on all the things we needed to do over the last 5 months and how we found ourselves in flow. We were working hard, we were working long hours, we didn't have clear requirements, we didn't feel like we had enough resources, we didn't feel like we had enough time, yet we just delivered and delivered and delivered. And our employees felt really, really good because they were feeling like they were making real impact, doing meaningful, doing purposeful work. And so going forward, that is going to be our North Star, is how do we maintain a hyper focus on enabling the business? And the first question we simply have to ask whenever we're looking at outcome is, if this is all about the business and we want a business-centric approach, then simply we should ask, what is it that the business wants? And the answer, this may sound a little cheesy and a little too obvious, but this is exactly the answer. The business just wants to maximize business value. And every business decides for themselves what their business value is. The security program does not make that decision. The IT program doesn't make that decision. The risk officer does not make that decision. That is a decision that is solely the business's prerogative to make. And that could be, of course, that would have a heavy focus on making customers successful. There likely could be some financial outcomes. There likely could be some outcomes, as in the case of Highmark Health, where we're a nonprofit. For us, the communities that we support are extremely important So serving our community and meeting our mission is extremely important. Taking care of our employees is really important. However, the business decides value is what we should tee off of. At Highmark Health, as I mentioned earlier, we've got insurance companies, we've got hospitals, we even have a technology services company that provides services to other insurance companies across the country. Each of those businesses have slightly different ways of defining business value. And so I want to come back to where we started the conversation earlier, and I said I want you to be thinking about what are some of the challenges you've been trying to address. I'll share some of mine. In the chat window, feel free to put in some of the challenges that you are facing, that you're experiencing, that you're thinking about, some that you may have overcome, some that you're starting to just scratch the surface on and figure out how to overcome. These are some of mine. I want to be able to prioritize security investments so we're confident we're making the right decisions. I want to be able to articulate justification for security investments so the business wants to invest in security. They don't feel like they need to, they don't feel like they have to, they don't feel like someone's making them, but they actually want to do it because they think it's a good idea. I want to be able to communicate employee expectations, set performance objectives, so employees are clear on what maximizes business outcomes, and those are the things that they're working on. I want to increase employee engagement because I want my high-performing employees to want to stay in this organization forever. And the only reason they're going to do that is if they feel when they walk into work every day that they are getting to do the best work of their careers, they are constantly working on becoming the best version of themselves. And I want to create a security program where everyone on my team feels confident that they're getting that. And if we do that, a happy outcome of that would be they'll want to stay in my security program versus at Highmark Health security program versus going elsewhere. And that is a very important outcome for us at Highmark. I want to be able to measure productivity of the security program. Why? So we can enumerate value to the business and to do so at least on a monthly basis. And so the business wants to keep investing in security. You'll see a lot of this is about creating more inherent motivation, is about want. It's not about need. It's not about I must do it, I should do it. There's nothing in here that's about compliance. It's not about pleasing the regulators. It's about doing the right thing. And the reality is if we do the right thing and we do it by our employees and by our customers and by our partners and stakeholders, we'll check all of the boxes from a regulatory standpoint because that is the spirit of the regulations and the various compliance regimes that we pay attention to on a regular basis. So I've talked about this at a very high level. Some of you may even feel like this feels rather fluffy. So I'd like to now take the next bit of time to really focus a little bit more on how do we make this a little bit more tangible, and there will be a little bit of math involved, but I promise it will be very, very simple arithmetic and everyone will be able to follow along. But that's sort of what we want to be able to do, is figure out how we define business value. And so if we think about how the business defines value, it's very, very simple. Yes, if there's a charitable non-for-profit, this may not necessarily be the best way to define value, but for most organizations, the simple equation to define value is you look at all of your revenues, you subtract all of your expenses, and then your net income is the value of the organization. Certainly for organizations that are for-profit, that are publicly traded, the stock price is simply based on the projected net incomes of the organization into the future. And so the market capitalization of the company is simply based on a forecast of net income. And so that is a pretty clear measure of value for an organization. And so this is how business value is measured in organizations. For most organizations, it comes down to net income as point in time. and a series of net incomes if we want to look at value out into the future. The question then becomes, how is security program typically measured? And it's just expenses. And I had a little bit of this epiphany sitting with my finance business partner, and we were going through our monthly business review, and I looked at my finance business partner, I said, you know, the only thing we talk about are expenses. And if the only thing that we talk about is expenses, then the only way that I can actually increase value for my security program is to reduce expenses. And in your mind, as I said to my finance business partner, that's why you keep coming to me about what my budget looks like. Am I over? Am I under? What's my head count? Because the only part of the value equation we have is expenses. And in the case of traditionally the security program, how it's measured, and to a large extent, even the one at Highmark, net income equals expenses. That is the very simple value equation that exists for most of our organizations today. And in a world like that, of course, there's going to be budgetary pressure, because that's the only way to increase value from a function that's considered a cost center. And so what you're seeing before you is literally the definition of a cost center. There's no revenue brought in. All they do is they bleed the rest of the company dry, and they spend. And the implication of that almost starts to feel like, okay, if all you do is spend, that means you're actually not delivering any outcomes. You're not really delivering value to the organization. So the question then we ask very naturally is, how could we increase security program value in an organization? Today, we've established that really the only way to do it is to reduce expenses. But what if we actually paid attention to the other line item in the net income equation, and we said, what if we actually increased revenues? Now, some of you may say, well, we don't really bring in revenue. We don't send a bill. We don't invoice the business. We don't necessarily, we're not an MSSP. We're not a security consulting firm. We don't have a security product to sell. So we don't really have revenue. And that's true. I worked for a service provider prior to this, and I worked for the Security Solutions Organization. So clearly we had security revenue, we tracked monthly recurring revenue, and we tracked non-recurring revenue, and we had a more typical net income statement. However, in an organization like Highmark, where security is treated more as a cost center, and customers aren't knocking on our door saying, can you sell us security services? We don't necessarily have revenue in the traditional sense. However, we do have business outcomes. And ultimately, revenue is just a financial term for business outcomes. And it's just a very clear measure for most organizations of the business outcomes they're delivering. If the business outcomes go up, that means the revenue must be up. If they go down, revenue must be down. And so if we start to think of revenue not as much in the literal sense, but think of it as really a proxy for measuring business outcomes, we might start to figure this out. So I want you to pay attention to a couple of items. You'll see this over and over again in the presentation. One is reducing expenses. That is denoted by the number 1. The second approach to increasing value is denoted by the number 2. And so the question to ask is, do we really want to focus on approach number 1 to increasing value, or would we rather prefer we build more ways to figure out how to increase value using approach number 2? I don't know about you, but I would much prefer talking about how I can increase value by delivering better business outcomes versus having a more negative conversation around how can I continue to reduce costs in order to increase value. There has to be a better way. And so what are the business outcomes of a security program that could be leveraged in approach number 2? At Highmark Health, over several years of running the security program and trying and playing around with different business outcomes, we've come up with exactly 4 business outcomes. And I've yet to come across a situation where everything that we do and our gut says this is of value does not fall into at least one, if not more, of these 4 business outcomes. And these are, the first one is risk reduction. As many of you may have guessed, The second one is customer experience. The third one is operational excellence. So things like quality go into here, things like SLO go into here, things like cost and efficiency, all of those types of metrics and measures and outcomes fall within operational excellence. And then the last one is compliance. In many, many cases, compliance is an outcome of delivering the other three. We're still at a point that we have that as a separate outcome. In the future, we'd like to get to the point that we focus on why we need to be compliant, and it's not just to please the regulators, but it's likely to reduce risk, give someone a better experience, or improve operational excellence. But for now, compliance remains as one of our top 4 business outcomes. We are in healthcare after all. However, by far the single biggest business outcome that we deliver is around risk reduction. Given the nature of this conference and given the nature of what I do day to day, this of course is the biggest focus. And for the rest of our session, we'll really focus a little bit more on risk reduction than we will on the other items. However, what we're going to talk about does apply to some extent to some large extent actually to the other items as well. So how do we then measure some of these outcomes? What outcomes of a security program do we typically measure? If on the y-axis we plot value, what I would offer is what we typically measure is the how. We seldom get to the what, and we almost never get to the why. The how is approach number 1, which is all focused on technical enhancements. And this would be the equivalent of saying, boss, we need to buy 3,463 bricks. And then I ask, well, tell me why you want to get those bricks. And the answer is, well, that's a silly question. Obviously, we want to get 3,600 bricks to build a wall. I mean, everybody knows what bricks are used for. And if we think about many of the conversations we have in the world of security, that's what they are. I need to install DLP. I need to have EDR. I need to have SASE. I need to have endpoint DLP. I need to have this. Why? Well, it's obvious because I have to have it. And that is a focus on the how. That's a technical enhancement that we focus on. We don't necessarily talk about what's going to happen as a result of implementing, executing, installing that technical enhancement, and we almost never connect it to why someone should actually care beyond the security program. And so our focus is all really on the technical enhancement, which is all about approach number 1. Where we need to shift is, where we should be measuring is the what. So I could just be getting a bunch of bricks to build a wall, but that service improvement, the reason I'm building it is to improve some kind of a service that I'm already delivering. And that could be, I'm building these walls in such a way that I'm going to build a hospital. Okay, that's significantly more exciting than I'm going to install a bunch of these 3-letter acronyms on X thousands of endpoints or on a bunch of network segments. That's not as meaningful as I'm going to build a hospital. I'm going to secure this customer portal. I'm going to enable us to connect securely and integrate securely with this acquisition that we're having with a third party. However, by far the most important one, and this is the one that we as security professionals probably struggle with most, is explaining the why. Not explaining the why in a security context and in security terms, but explaining the why in terms of a true business outcome and in terms that the organization would care and would understand. So in this world, the hospital would be the what, the why would be, we're doing this because we want people to embrace health. We want people to be healthy. We want less cardiac disease. We want less diabetes. We want people to be able to become the best version of themselves and free themselves to be their best. That would be a real business outcome beyond just we're going to build a hospital. Given that we don't have enough time, what I just talked about here with the technical enhancements, service improvements, and business outcomes, that makes up what we call the BOSITE framework at Highmark. We start with the business outcomes, which is approach number 2, a little bit of service improvement, and then we end up with the technical enhancements. So we don't start with the technical enhancements, we actually end with the technical enhancements. So how should we measure security program value? And if we leverage the BOSITE framework, that then tells us that the revenues are really our business outcomes. And if our biggest business outcome is risk reduction, I think we know how to measure risk reduction, and we've got a framework out there to do just that, which is why we're all attending this conference this week. The expense piece is technical enhancements, and when we subtract all that out, we actually get value. But in reality, the way that this should work is the other way around. We should figure out what the business outcomes are, and then that goes back to the business, and the CFO can look at this and understand it and want to potentially make even more investments in security. I wanted to start wrapping up by giving you some specific approaches to optimizing the security program value. And I'll break these up into 4 areas. One is future investments and controls. Any proposed investments with acronyms, technology, or vendor names in the title should not be considered, period. All proposed security investments should be prioritized based on measurable business outcomes, risk reduction being the biggest one. And we all know there's a methodology for making that happen. For current controls, we should measure actual business outcomes from the top most expensive controls. That should include hardware, software, and labor. And then we should decide to sunset technologies with low or negative value. So a control that where the cost of the technical enhancement is actually greater than the business outcome actually has negative value. And when we eliminate that control, our net income or our net value for the security program will actually go up. It won't go down. This is a hard thing to do. As a security professional, when I hear eliminating a security control, that doesn't make me feel good. But as we, including me, make that transition from security professional to risk professional, we'll realize that that's absolutely the right thing to do in certain circumstances. I'll tell you, at Highmark, we took a security control that was probably our second most expensive in our entire program of 300 security controls. And after only 4 weeks of assessing the value of it, it was very clear to everyone it was not paying over $1 million to support that security control on an annual basis. We took that money and used it to actually implement security controls that were delivering real value. Employees, all security employees' performance objectives should align to either business outcomes or service improvements, especially leaders. If your leaders don't understand the business outcomes or service improvements they're delivering, then the individuals that report to them will absolutely not understand it. And we want to go up that value chain that we talked about a bit earlier. From a communication standpoint, keep executives and the business out of the cockpit. Convey business outcomes and sometimes service improvements, but not technical enhancements. When I have to go get budget approval for significant security investments because our risk is greater than our tolerance, when I've had those discussions with senior leaders of the organization, walk through my presentation, if anyone in the meeting said, Omar, can you tell us what you're going to spend the money on? That answer did not exist in the presentation. I did not include in the presentation what I'm actually going to spend the money on, because the what is for me to figure out, the how is for me to figure out, the why is for the business to be aware of and to approve, and then they can hold me accountable if I'm not successful. And so speaking of how, if these are the approaches and you're really interested in this and you're thinking, I really want to take some of this to the next level, in 30 minutes, there's no way I was going to be able to do all of that. Good news is we're at a conference with phenomenal speakers, lots of organizations that have been solving these problems for years, partnering with organizations that are proponents of the FAIR framework. I would encourage you to attend those sessions, view the agenda. There's probably others that will also be answering these questions. To wrap up, we'll end with the question that we started with, which is, what does the business want? And we said they want to maximize business value. the two things I would leave you with is similar to when you're sitting in a restaurant, you don't let the server decide what your need is. You ask you as the patron dictate what your business need is, and the server brings you what your need is. In the security program, our job is to serve the business, and we should do so not based on our needs, our wants, our desire, the shininess of the new technology that we see, but it should be based on the needs of the business, and it should be in the language of the business. So if I were to go to a restaurant and they were to speak to me a different language, I would probably walk away saying, I don't care how good the food is. I'm not even sure what to order and what's going to be in it. I will likely end up going elsewhere. Important to do it based on the business needs, and important to do it based on their language.
Well, thank you everyone for attending the session. I hope you found it to be of value and you've taken some insights and some learnings that you can apply to your role. If there's anything I can do to help, to support, please feel free to reach out. And as a reminder, there's a lot of other great sessions at FairCon this year, many of which I just talked about a couple minutes ago. I would strongly urge you to go attend those sessions and enjoy the rest of your conference. And thank you again for attending.